I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The grand halls of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of secrets, triumphs, and silent heartbreaks, but nothing could have prepared the British monarchy for the explosive storm that was about to unfold in the summer of 2026. Under the shimmering golden sunlight of a warm London afternoon, the palace gardens were transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of royal pride and majestic grandeur. The perfectly manicured lawns were vibrant with the deep red of poppies and the delicate elegance of English roses in full bloom, setting a flawless stage for a massive celebratory gathering. This specific event was of paramount importance, meticulously designed to honor individuals who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty and dedication to the monarchy throughout the turbulent and transformative reign of King Charles III. It was meant to be a public declaration of stability, unity, and resilience after years of unprecedented royal upheavals and public scrutiny. The guest list was highly exclusive, populated entirely by prominent philanthropists, major financial donors, trusted political advisors, and the core members of the royal family. The atmosphere was thick with the sophisticated, melodious strains of classical violins, the sparkling clink of expensive crystal champagne glasses, and the polite, hushed whispers of the British elite. King Charles entered the grand reception hall with his customary dignified bearing and sovereign grace, yet an astute observer could easily detect the heavy veil of fatigue lingering in his eyes, a remnant of his exhausting months of intensive medical treatments. Despite the physical toll, he wore a warm, genuine smile as he walked through the crowd, shaking hands and carrying the colossal responsibility of a monarch on his shoulders. However, as the king's watchful gaze swept across the crowded room, his posture suddenly froze, and his warm smile momentarily faltered. Standing quietly in a distant corner of the opulent hall, framed by the towering arched windows, was a highly familiar figure whose presence sent an immediate jolt of unease through his spine. It was Annabelle Elliot, the biological sister of Queen Camilla. She was dressed in an impeccably elegant, dark-colored evening gown, casually holding a glass of white wine and chatting cheerfully with a small group of high-profile international diplomats. The king's mind instantly began to race, turning over the details of the event's preparation. He distinctly remembered reviewing and personally approving every single name on the official guest list multiple times to ensure absolute security, and Annabelle Elliot's name was completely, undeniably absent from that document. A sudden wave of deep suspicion and anxiety surged within the king's heart, replacing the festive joy with cold calculation. Charles subtly clenched his fists by his side, forcing his face to remain a mask of royal serenity as he leaned in close to his wife. His voice was low, carrying a sharp undertone of tension that only she could hear as he asked when her sister had arrived, noting that he had no recollection of signing off on her invitation. Camilla spun around with an abrupt, almost jerky motion, her practiced smile stiffening for a fraction of a second before she skillfully recovered her composure. She gently placed her hand over her husband's arm in a reassuring gesture, speaking in a soft, hurried whisper that sought to dismiss his worries. She pleaded with him, calling him her dear and reminding him that Annabelle was simply family, close blood, and that she had personally extended the invitation as a gesture for an extended family gathering where everyone was meant to enjoy themselves. She urged him not to make a massive issue out of it, warning that any confrontation would spark unnecessary commotion among the guests, and asked him to trust her so that a familiar face wouldn't ruin the beautiful atmosphere. Charles looked deeply into his wife's eyes, searching the familiar features for any sign of hidden deception or insincerity. He loved Camilla profoundly, having stood firmly by her side through decades of relentless public storms, fierce media attacks, and internal family divisions. Yet, in this exact moment, he sensed a chilling, invisible distance opening up between them. He gave a slow, reluctant nod, choosing not to cause a public scene in front of the watchful eyes of dignitaries and cameras, but his low voice carried a heavy promise of a serious conversation later that evening. As the party progressed, the outer facade of the palace remained perfectly elegant, filled with lively laughter and grand toasts, but inside the king's mind, the dangerous seeds of doubt had firmly taken root. From a distance, Charles kept a watchful eye on Annabelle, noticing how her polished social interactions were contrasted by hurried glances at her watch and restless, deliberate movements. The celebration eventually drew to a formal close, and the king breathed a quiet sigh of relief as the final guests departed, but the fragile peace lasted for barely an hour. As the vast palace fell into its midnight silence, a piercing, high-priority alarm from the Royal Security Department shattered the quiet, sending immediate shockwaves through the very core of the institution. The Sapphire Jubilee Snowflake Brooch, a legendary national treasure of immeasurable historical value, had completely vanished from the high-security subterranean vault. This masterpiece, valued at over £24 million and crafted from 48 incredibly rare Baffin Island sapphires and hundreds of brilliant diamonds, was not just an expensive piece of jewelry, it was a sacred national diplomatic symbol of the reign. Charles stood completely paralyzed in his private study, his face draining of all color as a mixture of blinding rage and profound heartbreak washed over him. He slammed his hand heavily onto his mahogany desk, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of anger and despair as he declared the theft impossible, pointing out that this was a national treasure stolen from right inside their own secure home. His heart ached with a sharp, physical pain because he understood that this was far worse than a mere material loss. It was a catastrophic betrayal at the absolute center of his life, a place where he had invested his complete, unquestioning trust. The entire royal security apparatus was instantly thrown into a state of maximum alert as the king ordered an aggressive, uncompromising internal investigation. Standing right beside him, Camilla desperately tried to maintain her regal, calm demeanor, but Charles could see the subtle tremors of anxiety breaking through her carefully constructed mask. The quiet summer night had officially transformed into the violent opening act of a historical scandal, and King Charles knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary, opportunistic burglary. It was a calculated inside job, and the terrifying evidence was beginning to suggest that the architect of this betrayal was someone who slept right beside him in the royal bedchamber. The atmosphere inside the palace darkened instantly as the elegant hallways were stripped of their warmth, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence that was broken only by the rapid, echoing footsteps of armed security details and elite investigators. Charles could not find a single moment of rest. He immediately convened a highly confidential, midnight emergency meeting in the deepest recesses of the palace. His voice, usually measured and diplomatic, cut through the cold air like a razor as he commanded the team to review every single security camera, analyze all entry and exit data, and scrutinize every single electronic log associated with the treasure vault before the sun rose. The security experts worked frantically under the harsh, pale glow of their monitors, fast-forwarding through hours of high-definition surveillance footage while the king sat in the center of the room, his eyes locked onto the screens as his chest tightened with a mixture of dread and fury. As the digital images were sharpened and filtered, Charles gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. Approximately 30 minutes before the grand summer party had concluded, the cameras captured Annabelle Elliot quietly slipping away from the main reception area. She did not take the standard pathways. Instead, she navigated through the dimly lit, rarely used service corridors, her movements surprisingly agile and deliberate as she actively avoided the primary camera angles. It was glaringly obvious that her path was not accidental. She possessed an intimate, highly accurate knowledge of the palace's security blind spots. Simultaneously, the main security system recorded the precise electronic swiping of a highly authorized internal access card at the heavy reinforced doors of the Sapphire Vault. This specific card was a privilege reserved exclusively for senior royal staff, high-ranking security directors, or individuals granted extraordinary personal permission by the monarch family itself. Charles muttered to himself in a tense, guttural whisper, realizing that there was absolutely no coincidence left to hide behind. He turned his blazing, demanding eyes toward the head of royal security, pointing out that Annabelle had no legitimate, lawful reason to ever be near that restricted area, especially after showing up uninvited to a party that perfectly timed with the disappearance of a national treasure. The head of security, with beads of nervous sweat forming on his forehead despite the intense air conditioning of the room, bowed his head and confirmed that the access card was swiped at precisely 22:47, less than an hour before the empty display case was discovered, leaving absolutely no physical signs of forced entry. Charles stood up, his heavy, rhythmic footsteps pacing the floor as the suspicion in his heart grew like a malignant tumor. He vividly recalled how quickly and smoothly Camilla had moved to soothe his initial anxieties during the party, raising a terrifying new question in his mind. Did his own queen know about this master plan in advance, and was she actively protecting her sister? The mere thought inflicted a deep, psychological wound, reminding him of how he had elevated Camilla to the status of Queen Consort with absolute devotion, only to find that sacred bond being brutally tested by greed. He stopped at the massive glass window, staring out into the pitch-black void of the royal gardens, whispering his wife's name in a tone of profound, heartbreaking anguish. He refused to blindly accuse the woman he loved, but the cold, hard data unfolding before him was too precise, too devastating to ignore. He quietly issued a secret directive to monitor all of Camilla's personal communications and digital activities over the past month, while expanding the dragnet around her sister. As the investigation team dug deeper into the system, they uncovered an even more unsettling reality. The thief knew the exact internal codes and shifting schedules of the guards, a level of detail that no ordinary royal guest could ever dream of possessing. This was a flawless, highly sophisticated operation that required an elite insider. Meanwhile, in the absolute privacy of her royal quarters, Queen Camilla was privately unraveling, pacing the floor restlessly while clutching a silk handkerchief with white-knuckled intensity. She knew her husband's character better than anyone else. She knew that beneath his gentle exterior lay a fiercely resolute sovereign who would never stop until he uncovered the absolute truth once his suspicions were aroused. Fear for her survival and a desperate, clawing instinct to protect her historic position fought for dominance inside her mind. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass, whispering a frantic, silent prayer to herself to stay calm, desperately believing that Annabelle was smart enough to leave absolutely no traceable evidence behind. By the time the first cold rays of dawn began to break over the London skyline, the preliminary forensic report was placed directly into the king's trembling hands. The nightmare had not faded with the night. It had solidified into an inescapable reality. There were no external breaches, no broken locks, and no foreign fingerprints. The treason was born entirely from within the palace walls, leaving the exhausted monarch standing at a devastating historical crossroads where he would be forced to choose between the survival of his family and his sacred, sworn oath to protect the honor of the British crown. The morning sun that rose over London did not bring warmth to Buckingham Palace, but instead illuminated a cold, industrial operation that was shifting gears beneath the surface. King Charles did not leave his private office for breakfast, nor did he allow any standard royal staff to enter his quarters except for the chief of intelligence. The weight of the preliminary report felt like a physical anchor on his chest, confirming that the high-security vault had been accessed by an authorized internal card used by someone who possessed an intimate, almost impossible knowledge of the palace's daily security architecture. Charles sat at his desk, his eyes bloodshot from a completely sleepless night, staring at a list of names that had been whittled down to a single, terrifying conclusion. He knew that if he allowed his personal emotions to dictate his actions now, the institutional integrity of the British monarchy would dissolve before the eyes of a highly critical public. He raised his eyes to the intelligence chief, his voice arriving in a dry, raspy whisper that carried the absolute coldness of a sovereign demanding absolute obedience. He ordered the immediate, quiet tracking of every single security officer who had been assigned to the underground treasury perimeter during the critical window between 2200 and midnight. As the specialized intelligence unit began their digital sweep, tapping into internal communication devices and tracking secure financial transactions, an immediate anomaly ruptured the baseline data. One specific senior guard, a man who had served the royal household faithfully for over 15 years and was directly responsible for the mechanical custody of the vault doors that evening, had failed to report for his mandatory dawn briefing. He had vanished completely from his designated living quarters within the palace grounds without submitting any formal leave request, leaving his uniform and personal phone behind, but taking his highly encrypted emergency communication transponder. Charles received this update with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, his palm coming down on the wooden desk with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed in the quiet room. He declared that a guard does not simply vanish into thin air without a powerful catalyst, stating that this was the definitive proof of a systemic inside conspiracy operating within his own inner circle. He instantly authorized a nationwide, high-priority manhunt, bypassing standard local police channels to deploy an elite tactical intelligence team that operated under his direct sovereign authority. The hunt was swift, relentless, and calculated, utilizing real-time satellite tracking to ping the unique signal of the encrypted royal transponder that the fleeing guard had mistakenly kept in his possession. Within 4 hours of intense, silent coordination, the tactical team localized the signal to a nondescript, low-profile apartment complex situated deep within the suburban grid of outer London. The guard was trapped in a state of absolute, blind panic, frantically stuffing bundles of cash and forged travel documents into a leather duffel bag in a desperate attempt to catch a private ferry across the English Channel to continental Europe. The entry was seamless and quiet, executed by Royal Special Forces who neutralized the target without firing a single shot or alerting the surrounding neighborhood, ensuring that the media remained entirely oblivious to the operation. By the time darkness began to settle over the city once again, the fugitive guard was brought back through the hidden, subterranean gates of Buckingham Palace, his face completely pale and his body trembling with the realization that his life was effectively over. He was escorted directly into a heavily soundproofed, windowless interrogation room located deep beneath the palace structure, where King Charles was already waiting, sitting quietly in the shadows. The king did not scream. Instead, he stepped into the light, his eyes boring into the shaking man with a profound mixture of royal fury and personal disappointment that was far more terrifying than physical violence. Charles spoke in a low, measured tone that cut through the stifling air, reminding the guard of his long years of service to the crown and pointing out the utter tragedy of choosing betrayal for a handful of foreign currency. The king offered a singular, uncompromising choice, complete, unvarnished truth in exchange for a recommendation of judicial leniency, or absolute silence followed by the full, crushing weight of a treason prosecution with no mercy. The guard collapsed psychologically under the immense pressure of the king's gaze and the undeniable mountain of digital evidence stacked against him. In a broken, trembling voice that was barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system, he confessed that he had been compromised by the highest level of authority within the palace walls. He explicitly named Queen Camilla as the architect who had approached him weeks prior, utilizing her status to extract the shifting schedules, structural blind spots, and vault access codes while transferring massive sums of money through untraceable offshore intermediary accounts to secure his cooperation. He confessed that his sole role was to physically open the final biometric gateway, allowing Annabelle Elliot to enter the vault unnoticed and extract the Sapphire Jubilee Snowflake Brooch without triggering the central alarm matrix. The confession hung in the cold air of the interrogation room like a devastating explosive device, causing Charles to turn his back to the room as his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles threatened to pierce his skin. He hid his watering, reddened eyes from his subordinates, refusing to let them see the profound heartbreak of a husband who had just received definitive proof of his wife's ultimate betrayal. He ordered the team to record every specific detail, including the exact transaction timestamps and the communication channels used, before issuing the immediate executive order for the secret arrest of Annabelle Elliot that very night. Meanwhile, unaware that the guard had already broken under interrogation, Queen Camilla and her sister were descending into their own private hell of panic inside the closed rooms of Clarence House. The initial confidence that had sustained them through the summer party had completely evaporated, replaced by an oppressive, terrifying silence as they realized that the king's investigation was moving with an unnatural, terrifying speed. Camilla paced the floor of her private sitting room, her fingers gripping a silk handkerchief so tightly that the fabric began to tear under the tension. She turned to Annabelle, her voice shaking as she whispered that they could not afford to sit idly while the net closed around them, demanding that they immediately sever all remaining ties to the guard. Annabelle nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and lingering greed, suggesting that they transfer an additional, massive sum of money through their European intermediaries to buy his absolute, permanent silence. They acted with frantic haste, initiating a final, desperate electronic transfer accompanied by a strict, threatening message instructing the guard to destroy all remaining devices and flee the country immediately. They genuinely believed that money could still buy their salvation, unaware that their desperate attempt to cover their tracks was arriving far too late to change their fate. The digital intercept team operating under the king's command captured the transaction in real time, locking the financial routing data directly into the growing chain of evidence against the royal sisters. The guard, still sitting in the basement interrogation cell, looked at the digital printout of the new transfer presented to him by the investigators and let out a bitter, hollow laugh. He looked up at King Charles, stating that the extra money was completely worthless now that his freedom was gone, and reiterating that the entire plan was entirely orchestrated by the Queen to secure a massive financial reserve fund for her family's future. The chain of evidence was now mathematically complete, irrefutable, and completely devastating to the future of the British monarchy. Charles stood alone in his private office, looking out at the dark silhouette of London, tears finally cutting down his aged, wrinkled cheeks as he asked the darkness why the woman he loved had brought this ruin upon their house. His personal grief was vast, but the ancient duty to the sovereign crown was absolute, and he knew that the final, unavoidable confrontation with his wife was only moments away. The grandfather clock in the private conference room of Buckingham Palace struck 2 in the morning, its heavy chimes echoing through a room that felt like a judicial execution chamber for the royal family's future. King Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by thick, soundproofed walls and the dim, flickering amber glow of the historical chandeliers. The arrested guard, still in handcuffs and flanked by 2 silent special forces officers, sat at the opposite end, his face still maintaining a deathly pale, defeated expression. The heavy oak doors clicked open, and Queen Camilla and Annabelle Elliot were escorted into the room by the chief of royal security, their footsteps slow and dragging as the last remnants of their composure dissolved. Camilla's hands were shaking visibly despite her desperate attempt to clench them together, while Annabelle kept her eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look up at the sovereign who had once been her brother-in-law. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with the terrifying energy of an impending historical storm that would alter the destiny of the British crown. Charles looked directly at his wife, his face showing the profound lines of a devastating physical and emotional fatigue, yet his posture remained unyieldingly dignified, carrying the full, terrifying authority of the law. He spoke in a low, resonant voice that vibrated through the quiet room, declaring that the time for denial had officially ended and that they were now standing face to face with the absolute, unvarnished truth. He signaled the guard to speak, and the broken man raised his head, his voice cracking with immense tension as he repeated his full, detailed confession directly to the faces of the women who had compromised him. He stated clearly that Queen Camilla had personally provided the internal security maps, scheduled the specific maintenance windows when the cameras would be blind, and transferred the offshore bribe money to his accounts, all while directing Annabelle to physically extract the Sapphire Jubilee Snowflake Brooch from its reinforced casing. Camilla's face turned completely ashen as she attempted to interrupt him, her voice faltering and cracking as she reached toward Charles, pleading that he had misunderstood the situation and claiming she only acted to protect the family's independent financial future. However, Charles raised his hand in a sharp, absolute gesture of dismissal, his patience completely exhausted by the transparent lies. He ordered the technology team to activate the large digital monitor on the wall, revealing a highly detailed, chronological presentation of the forensic evidence compiled over the last 48 hours. The screen displayed crystal-clear surveillance footage of Annabelle navigating the restricted corridors with the guard's direct assistance, accompanied by exact electronic timestamps matching the access card data. Below the video footage, the investigators had mapped out the complete financial routing history, showing the direct flow of funds from offshore accounts linked to Camilla's maiden family directly into the Guard's private European holdings, finalized by the intercepted panic messages sent from Clarence's house just hours earlier. The logical chain of evidence was mathematically perfect, seamless, and completely irrefutable, leaving no legal loopholes or room for deniability. Annabelle collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of a long-term prison sentence crashed down upon her, while Camilla's regal posture finally crumbled completely under the crushing weight of the truth. Charles looked at his wife, the profound pain of a betrayed husband forcing him to close his eyes and turn his face away for a long, agonizing moment. He had loved her deeply, fought against the entire world and his own family to place the Queen's crown upon her head, only to discover that her loyalty had been completely corroded by an insatiable greed for independent wealth and power. Immediately following the conclusion of the midnight confrontation, the chief of royal security stepped forward and officially placed Annabelle Elliot under arrest for the unlawful seizure and theft of national assets belonging to the royal collection. Camilla was placed under immediate, strict house arrest inside an isolated sector of the palace, facing a massive treason and accomplice investigation directed by the Independent Crown Prosecution Service. Although the royal communications team tried desperately to manage the flow of information, the sheer scale of the midnight raid and the sudden disappearance of the Queen from public life caused the secret to leak to international intelligence channels within hours. The global media erupted into a frenzy of unprecedented breaking news alerts, and the British Parliament immediately convened an extraordinary, closed-door session to debate the constitutional crisis and demand a full review of Camilla's legal status as Queen Consort. The sterling reputation of the monarchy, which Charles had spent his entire reign trying to stabilize and protect after decades of domestic scandals, suffered a nearly fatal blow, leaving public opinion sharply and violently divided across the Commonwealth. Charles stood entirely alone in his dark office as the first gray light of a turbulent morning began to tint the London horizon, watching the rain beat against the glass as tears rolled freely down his wrinkled, aged face. He whispered into the empty room that he had tried his absolute best to balance his heart, but the survival and sacred honor of the monarchy had to be protected above all personal affections, no matter how painful the cost. The shocking incident marked a historic, irreversible turning point for the British royal family, establishing a modern precedent that no individual, regardless of their proximity to the throne or their status as queen, was above the rule of law. Annabelle Elliot was quietly processed through the criminal justice system to face a highly publicized public trial, while Camilla was systematically stripped of her public duties, her financial allowances, and her political influence, living under permanent security surveillance. The British monarchy officially entered a cold, transparent era of absolute accountability, purchased at the ultimate, heartbreaking cost of a king's personal happiness and the total ruin of his home.